Hello, my name is Sam Feltham. I'm the Director of the Public Health Collaboration and welcome to the PHC Virtual Conference 2020. The coronavirus has changed all of our lives, but where there's an obstacle, there's also an opportunity. And that opportunity comes in the guise of this virtual conference. Earlier this year, we had to postpone our two main events, the annual conference and the Real Food Rocks Festival, until next year. These events allow us to connect, learn and grow, but they also help us raise crucial funds for the PHC to continue. With that in mind, and before we let the next presenter speak, this virtual conference is 100% free for all. But if you find the content valuable today, then please consider donating £2 or whatever you can afford through the Total Giving website via www.phcuk.org/donate. Or if you're in the UK, you can simply text PHC to 70660 to donate £2 directly from your phone. We hope you enjoy the conference from wherever you are in the world, and be sure to get involved in the civil conversation on the comment section here on YouTube or via the hashtag PHCVCon2020 on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Thanks for your support, take care and stay safe.
As much as we'd like to, and for the sake of simplicity, we can't and shouldn't simply lump all sugars together as one. Today I'm going to be taking you through how fructose and glucose are metabolized differently in the body, and how it's only one of them that leads to the development of insulin resistance and the rest of the metabolic syndrome within the body. So as a GP, I really like to keep things as simple as possible. And I think it's a very important quality in a primary care doctor to be able to communicate complicated scientific ideas in language that is understandable by our patients. So I'm a really big fan of what Dr. David Unwin did with regards to his infographics for type 2 diabetics. This, of course, is the cereal infographic where we see how a recommended serving of cereal affects blood glucose compared to a standard 4-gram spoon of sugar. And this is such a simple way of explaining things to people, and these are a tool that has really helped me in my clinic and helped my patients. So I've got to say a big thank you to David for those. But look at the wording closely. What these graphics are showing is the impact on blood glucose of these cereals. Now, put aside for a second that some of these cereals actually contain sugar, what is important to remember here is something that we're taught in school biology lessons, but to be honest, a lot of us have forgotten by the time we get to medical school. And that lesson is that starch is really just long chains of glucose that start to get broken down as soon as food enters our mouths. You may remember doing amylase experiments at school, but if you don't, you can do your own simple amylase experiment at home. All you do is just get a chunk of bread and keep chewing it, because what happens is the salivary amylase starts to break down those starches into glucose, and it becomes very sweet actually quite quickly. That glucose is then able to travel into the blood, which stimulates insulin production in the pancreas, and insulin promotes fat storage, forming the basis of the carbohydrate theory of obesity. And a common counter-argument is that there are populations that consume large amounts of starch without suffering high incidence of obesity or diabetes, or at least until relatively recently there were. And this is something that is often referred to as the Asian paradox. And we're not just talking about wholesome whole grains either. We're talking about white rice, polished to remove all those fibrous husks. And yet many of those populations still didn't develop significant levels of obesity and type 2 diabetes. And this blows a very big hole in the theory that it's the carbohydrates themselves that are inherently detrimental to human health. But of course, this picture has changed pretty significantly in the last 20 years, with an estimated 1 in 10 people in China having type 2 diabetes. Especially significant when you think that that population in China is approximately 1.4 billion people. And as much as we'd like to consider that it is as simple as labeling all carbohydrates as bad, we all know someone who can chow down on large bowls of pasta week in, week out, in, year out without gaining any significant weight or apparently developing type 2 diabetes. And for every 65-year-old in coronary care following a heart attack due to poorly controlled diabetes, there is probably a non-diabetic 85-year-old at home eating a sandwich. And telling someone whose metabolism can clearly handle those carbohydrates that carbs are in of themselves bad is usually met with a pretty blank stare and a shake of the head before they continue filling their faces with fusilli. And I've always liked the quote, "Everything should be as simple as possible, but not simpler," by Albert Einstein. Now, he was a smart guy, wasn't he? And the world of nutrition is a little bit known for these oversimplifications. And yes, calories in versus calories out, I am looking at you. And as doctors, we're well known for hiding behind our jargon, but we can also be a little bit guilty of oversimplifying things. And this can sometimes increase the confusion. And I'm thinking really of using cholesterol levels and lipoprotein levels interchangeably. And it's often easier to talk about blood sugar rather than blood glucose. And yes, biologically speaking, glucose is technically a sugar, but it's very different from what we commonly call sugar, aka table sugar or sucrose. And it's important to remember that table sugar or sucrose is different from glucose, and the way the two are metabolized by the body is different and may help us go at least some of the way to understanding what is causing the insulin resistance in the first place. Because sucrose has a very different impact on the body than glucose alone does. The key difference is the addition of fructose into the mix, and the current evidence, as I'm going to show you in this talk, suggests that it's fructose, not starch or indeed glucose, that is responsible for the initiation of the metabolic syndrome. So let's go back to basics for a second. Glucose is the predominant form of circulating sugar in animals, while sucrose is the most common circulating sugar in plants. Plants and animals also store their sugars differently. In the human body, we store glucose as glycogen, but in plants, glucose is stored as starch. Fructose is not present in either. Now, it's a common misconception that fruits only contain fructose and that sucrose is actually added to the human food chain. But in reality, sucrose is found naturally occurring in plants. For example, sugar in banana is predominantly sucrose, with fructose and glucose both present as monosaccharides, but to a lesser level than the sucrose itself. And of course, things like sugar cane and sugar beet have significant stores of sucrose within them, which make them ideal to be refined into table sugar. So what is sucrose? Sucrose is a glucose molecule joined to a fructose molecule. It's a 50-50 mix which is quickly broken down in the gut. Similarly, there is also high fructose corn syrup, which is an artificial sugar made from corn syrup. Most commonly, it's a 55% mix of fructose and 45% of glucose. Sugar-sweetened beverages, and I of course include high fructose corn syrup sweetened beverage is in there, are a major source of added sugars in diets worldwide. On average, sugar-sweetened beverage contribute to approximately 7% of daily calories and nearly 50% of added sugars in the diet. The trend, of course, has been declining in terms of consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, and sugar taxation may have had some impact on that, but it's thought that it's still very, very common, particularly amongst younger people, with some statistics reporting that almost 66% of US young people still consume at least one sugar-sweetened beverage a day. Now, it's important to remember that neither fructose nor glucose are essential nutrients. They are not required for life by the human body. They provide no nutritional value above and beyond the energy that they provide. The important thing is that we've now added fructose into the mix, and it's herein that the problem occurs. Glucose, whether it's from starch that's been broken down or otherwise, is absorbed through the intestinal wall and taken into the bloodstream, where it is able to be used by every cell in the body. Now, tissues such as fat tissue and muscle tissue require the presence of insulin to take up that glucose from the bloodstream. Other cells, such as brain cells, don't require insulin to take up that blood glucose. And we often think of insulin as the storage hormone, and it does indeed have many storage-related roles within the body. Glucose uptake in the liver is also regulated by insulin, and insulin signals to the liver to store glucose as glycogen, that short-term energy store which I mentioned earlier, which can then be broken down between meals when insulin levels are low to supply the body with glucose. But the liver has only this limited capacity to store glycogen, and so when those glycogen stores are full, any glucose which has been taken up by the liver cells, additional to that, is then shunted into these pathways, leading to the synthesis of fats, which is a process known as de novo lipogenesis, literally making new fats. These fats are then formed into these very low density lipoproteins, or VLDL, which can then enter the circulation and deliver that fat load out to muscle cells and fat tissues. Now, you may have noticed that you haven't seen VLDL on your cholesterol panel. It wouldn't routinely be measured, but it can be estimated using your triglyceride levels. Therefore, triglycerides can be seen as a proxy marker for hepatic fat production, particularly fasted triglycerides. Now, let's look at fructose metabolism. Fructose is absorbed by the gut too. But whereas glucose can be metabolized by the entire body, fructose can't. Some is metabolized by the gut itself and some by the kidneys, but overwhelmingly fructose is taken from the gut through the portal vein to the liver, where it is rapidly absorbed without the need for insulin for access into the cells. And once in the liver, a not insignificant amount of fructose is actually turned into glucose. However, the rest promotes de novo lipogenesis, that new fat formation that I spoke about earlier. Now, I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty detailed biochemistry in this talk, but there are several well-established pathways by which fructose metabolism indirectly leads to insulin resistance in the liver. And these include by promoting de novo lipogenesis, by impairing fatty acid oxidation, by inducing endoplasmic reticulum stress, and by triggering hepatic inflammation. There's also a hypothesis that fructose can directly impede insulin signaling within the liver. Now, if you're really interested in the biochemistry side of things, I definitely recommend you checking out this recent review article that will be in the description down below this video. So enough with the biochemistry, cell biology bit for a minute. Let's relate this to a real life situation. So you've had your breakfast cereal, and despite the promise on the advert, it did not keep your hunger locked up until lunch. Fortunately, the same manufacturer kindly made you a tasty brunch biscuit, which you had about 11 a.m. But of course, by 12:30, because of the sugar crash you've already experienced, and because there wasn't really anything of actual nutritional value in the processed food you've already eaten, you reach for your lunch, and it's a sandwich with some crisps or chips if you're watching this in the States, and you're gonna wash it down with your favorite sugar sweetened beverage. Now, just in case your glycogen stores weren't full anyway from your breakfast and your brunch, the starch from the sandwich will soon break down and the glucose will sort that out. So what happens with the large amount of sucrose you've just drunk? Well, of course, it gets broken down in the gut, and the glucose portion of it can be used by the whole body. The fructose portion, however, is rapidly taken up by the liver. And because your glycogen stores are full, your liver is going to start making fat. And by the mechanisms I mentioned above, it will start to become insulin resistant. And so the liver is effectively saying to that glucose that's there, no thanks, I don't need any more of this glucose. And the insulin, it becomes harder to take it up. But that's fine. The glucose has got plenty of other places to go, right? But the fructose doesn't. That has to be dealt with by the liver. And it didn't need insulin to be taken up by the liver anyway. So it carries on getting turned into fat, which makes the insulin resistance worse. But the fructose doesn't care. It didn't need insulin to get into the liver cells in the first place. And it has to keep coming into the liver because it's coming straight down the portal vein from your gut, and it doesn't really have anywhere else to go. So you repeat this process day in, day out, and it's not just the sugar in the drinks, it's pretty much in all the processed food you're eating too. And you're producing more and more fat in your liver, and your liver is trying its best to export it out in those VLDL particles, but the rate at which your liver is making fat is greater than its ability to export it. And very much like flash flooding, when the drains are overwhelmed, the flood water builds up in the streets, the ability of the liver to export the fat from inside it becomes overwhelmed and droplets of fat form in your liver. And you now have fatty liver disease. But don't worry, you're in good company because an estimated 1 billion people around the world do too. So there you go. You're off to the races with your metabolic problems checklist. So you've got insulin resistance in there, which has started in your liver. You've got fatty liver disease too. You only need 3 and you've got your diagnosis of the metabolic syndrome. But don't worry, your liver is pretty resilient and it's going to do its best for a while to get rid of that fat, even for a long time after you've eaten, by spitting out that VLDL. And we can, of course, see this because your fasting triglycerides will be raised. And that is your 3rd tick box, and that is enough for that formal diagnosis of the metabolic syndrome. But let's not stop there, because the insulin resistance in your liver results in elevated systemic insulin levels, which causes your kidneys to retain fluid, leading to elevated blood pressure for number 4. And you only need abdominal obesity to round out the list. And here's the crazy thing. Evidence linking increased sugar intake to insulin resistance dates back to the 1970s. High sucrose feeding for 14 days in healthy adults resulted in a decreased response to insulin, with a 25% reduction in the lowering of blood glucose levels following insulin administration. So, insulin resistance. Unfortunately, many studies have been overfeeding studies and need to be taken with a pinch of salt, because overfeeding in itself can induce an element of insulin resistance, but ad libitum feeding studies have also shown similar results. 25% of daily energy requirement from fructose, which is the equivalent of 168 grams a day of fructose sweetened beverages for 10 weeks, increased blood glucose and fasting insulin levels. Changes which were not seen in the comparable glucose supplemented group. But yeah, 25% does sound like quite a lot, but even at much lower doses of fructose, 75 grams a day, supplemented in drinks for 12 weeks, increased insulin levels in obese men compared to their baseline. And since there have been much tighter controlled isocaloric studies with clever crossover study designs and things, with much the same results. And in addition, these studies have shown that it's hepatic insulin resistance, or insulin resistance in the liver, that develops before the whole body insulin resistance. Now, these studies and many more are referenced in the excellent review article that I mentioned earlier. And whilst you're there in the description, checking out the link to that below, check out the link to the excellent 2012 Banting Memorial Lecture article by Professor Roy Taylor, where he talks about the development of type 2 diabetes. In it, he speaks about the West of Scotland coronary prevention study, where a retrospective analysis of blood samples taken in the run-up to the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes shows an elevation in liver enzymes. Now, they're well within the normal range, but it is still likely to represent damage caused by the increasing buildup of fat within the liver, and that led to his following conclusion. Hepatic fat is building up and the process of type 2 diabetes is underway. Before the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, there is a long, silent scream from the liver. So we're starting to see a picture of how, for someone who is metabolically healthy, it is the consumption of especially large amounts of fructose that appears to cause far more in the way of metabolic problems than do starchy carbohydrates, aka glucose. So why on earth does this happen? Well, fructose is particularly sweet, and sweet things are generally more palatable, and this is the main reason it's added to stuff, and that enhanced palatability increases the amount we want to eat and can lead to overeating. And in the modern world with stable food supplies, this is clearly toxic. But when we consider it from an evolutionary standpoint, eating loads and loads of fruit as it ripens in the autumn and laying down some liver fat for the difficult winter ahead could be seen as a good thing. And we only have to go back a mere 330 million years to get back to a common ancestor with our bird friends. Now, migratory birds put on a huge amount of fat, including in the liver, in preparation for long flights. And it's the ability of ducks and geese to gain liver fat in this way, which is exploited to make the so-called delicacy of foie gras. Fructose and sucrose can bring about addiction-like behaviors such as binging by stimulating dopaminergic pathways in the brain. We also see different effects on blood flow within the hypothalamus and cerebral cortex with fructose and glucose that may have an impact on feeding behavior as well. Fructose is also less effective than glucose in suppressing the hunger hormone ghrelin. And again, this all sort of makes sense when we think about overfeeding to build up fat stores prior to hard winters. Being able to store fat in this way may have given people an evolutionary survival advantage. But does this explain the Asian paradox? Well, a lot's changed in the last quarter of a century in China, which may have contributed to the significant increase in rates of type 2 diabetes. There has been significant urbanization, which goes hand in hand with reduced physical activity and pollution. The change in diet has probably gone from a very nutritious diet, other than the starchy carbohydrates, to a less nutrient-dense one, which may also play a role. And it isn't hard to see that the addition of fructose from an increasingly westernized diet into a metabolism that was probably already at a tipping point due to high starch consumption might at least be contributing something to the explosion of type 2 diabetes that China has been seeing. Clearly, the fact that starch breaks down to glucose is very, very important for everybody who has a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes, and probably the vast majority of people who are overweight or obese. However, when we look at the metabolism of glucose and fructose, we see important differences where in the case of fructose, that actually leads to the initiation of what goes on to become the metabolic syndrome within the body. And hopefully this video serves to underline the danger of adding sugar to processed foods and sugar sweetened beverages. So if you've enjoyed this video, if you found it useful, I'd really appreciate you giving it a thumbs up, and I'm sure the wonderful people at the Public Health Collaboration would also appreciate you doing that too. I want to say a big thank you to Sam for inviting me to come and do this video for you guys in these really kind of strange times. And yeah, if you've got any questions or comments, then please do leave those down below. If you're not already, make sure you're subscribed to the Public Health Collaboration YouTube channel, and maybe subscribe to mine as well. Thank you for watching, everybody. Take care.